Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the Gospel of John. In the last few days, we've been looking at John chapter 2, verses 13 through 22, where Jesus cleanses the temple. But before we move on, I want to say one more thing about this moment in Jesus' ministry. Now, we know that all 4 Gospels record the event of Jesus cleansing the temple. But there's a difference. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they account for Jesus cleansing the temple toward the end of his ministry. It occurs at the very beginning of Passion Week, just a few days before Jesus' crucifixion and, of course, resurrection. That's when they place the cleansing of the temple. But John, as we've seen these last few days, places the cleansing of the temple at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. So there's a difference here. So what accounts for it? Why do they place them at 2 different times? Now, there's 2 possible solutions. There are some who have suggested that actually the cleansing occurred during Passion Week at the end of Jesus' ministry, as we see it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But that John, for theological reasons, puts it in a chronologically different place. He puts it at the beginning of the ministry to emphasize Jesus has come to cleanse the temple. So John doesn't mean us to understand it occurring there chronologically, but he does it for theological reasons. Now, that is an opinion, but it's not one I agree with. I think there's another thing going on here. I want you to notice some differences between the 2 accounts. For example, in John's account of the cleansing, after Jesus has cleansed the temple, the leaders asked him, "Where did you get the authority to do this?" And he says, as we've already looked at, "Tear down this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up again." But in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when they say, "Where did you get the authority to do this?" Jesus responds by saying, "What about John the Baptist? You tell me where his authority came from, and then I'll tell you where my authority comes from." And they refused to answer. And so he said, "Well, I won't tell you my authority either." You see, there's a difference there in the follow-up. There's also another difference. In John's gospel, after Jesus cleansed the temple, he said, "This is my Father's house. Why have you turned it into a marketplace?" We've talked about that. But in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, after Jesus cleanses the temple, he says, "This is meant to be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." You see the differences? That leads me to believe that Jesus cleansed the temple twice. He cleansed it twice. He cleansed it at the beginning of his ministry, as John reports, and then he repeated the action, he repeated the cleansing at the end of his ministry, as Matthew, Mark, and Luke report. You might ask, well, why did Jesus do it twice? Well, as any good teacher knows, repetition is the key to learning. If you want to teach anybody anything, a student of yours, you're probably going to have to repeat it over and over again. Most of us don't learn anything the first time. It takes repetition. So I think this is important. This was so important when Jesus was teaching about cleansing the temple. He does it he bookends his ministry with it. He begins his ministry with it, and he ends his ministry with it. So I think there are 2 separate cleansings of the temple. At the beginning of Jesus' ministry in John, and at the end of Jesus' ministry in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, Jesus does this with other things as well. For example, the most famous sermon Jesus preached in our mind is the Sermon on the Mount, which we find in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. But did you know that Jesus repeats that sermon, almost the same sermon, in Luke chapter 6? But there it's called the Sermon on the Plains. But it's got the Beatitudes again, much of the same teaching. So in Matthew it's called the Sermon on the Mount, and in Luke it's called the Sermon on the Plains. Well, which is it? Well, it's both, because Jesus preached it twice. Repetition. I know when I've got a good sermon, I always preach it more than once. I figure if it's worth preaching one time, it's worth preaching again. And obviously, Jesus preached the same kind of material at different times in different places. And that's what we have. Matthew 5 tells us when he preached it on the mountain. And Luke 6 tells us when he preached it on the plains. So you see, there's repetition in the Gospels. And I think that's what we have with the cleansing of the temple. At the beginning of Jesus' ministry, he cleansed the temple. That's in John. At the end of his ministry, he cleansed it again. Hadn't quite got the point yet. He cleansed it again, and that's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. See, the lesson was so important that Jesus repeated it to emphasize how needful it is that we allow God to cleanse us of anything that keeps us from being the people of God. Hope you join us again tomorrow as we continue our 5-minute Bible study in the Gospel of John.